we want to welcome you and good morning. And, I'm really sorry to publicly have to, do this to Rabbi Miller. And, it's going to be so easy with somebody who's just a simple Southern Jew.
Bruce, you're a Southern Jew. You grew up in Tennessee.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that. Well, of course, Rabbi, you spent all that time at a Quaker institution at Earlham. I mean, you were the liaison to Earlham.
But Bruce, 20 years before that, you were the rabbinic liaison to Earlham, the Quaker school.
I kind of forgot that. What we'd like to begin to do is something that has been part and parcel of Jewish tradition forever, which is the idea of debate. And in fact, civil debate amongst the rabbis was the cornerstone of our Jewish tradition. And in so many ways, what we're going to do this morning at looking at two Torah portions in the style and fashion of this is exactly what is our Jewish law, both our oral and our written tradition is based on in many ways. And we've, Rabbi Miller has prepared, and we have some great material that we're going to look at. And I'm going to see if I can figure out, I'm going to go to share screen. So what we'd like to do is to go through and look at the two stories, and then we have a series of questions that are there. And I know some of you have read, but we hopefully have some folks that it'll be, but it's hafok. We turn it and find different things in it. So Bill, will you read for us first? Let's start with let's just read through quickly the Genesis story.
When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, a first day. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water." God made the expanse, and it separated the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. God said, "Let the water below the sky be gathered into one area, that the dry land may appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw that this was good. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants of every kind, and trees of every kind, bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that this was good, and there was evening and there was morning, a third day. God said, let there be light, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night. They shall serve as signs for the set times, the days and the years, and they shall serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth. And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day, and the lesser light to dominate the night, and the stars. And God said, "Set them in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness." And God saw that this was good, and there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and birds," I can't see.
Sorry.
"And birds that fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." God created the great sea monsters and all the living creatures of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fertile and increase, fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day.
Super. Judith, will you go ahead and read for us? You have to unmute.
Yep. God said, "Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of every kind." And it was so. God made wild beasts of every kind, and cattle of every kind, and all kinds of creeping things of the earth. And God saw that this was good. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." And God created man in his image, in the image of God. He created him, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all living things that creep on earth." God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth in which there is the breath of life, I give all the green plants for food." And it was so. And God saw all that he had made and found it very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day.
Very good. And thus our creation story. And now, and we'll ask some questions about that. And let's now take a moment and go through our text for the binding of Isaac. And David Rosenblum, will you read for us?
Sure. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, "Abraham," and he answered, "Here I am." And God said, "Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you." So early next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey and took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, "You stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go up there, and we will worship, and we will return to you." Abraham took the wood from the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the fire stone and the knife, and the two walked off together. We'll need to move it up.
Sorry.
I think you went too far. Oh, yes, it is. Okay. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father." And he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here are the firestone and the wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son." And the two of them walked on together. They arrived at the place at which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then, you'll move it up one more time. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." And he answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me." When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, "On the mount of the Lord there is vision." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessings upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command." Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together to Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba.
Okay, that looks good. I'm going to stop sharing. So we have some critical questions down here, which we'll just take a look at real quick. And the first one is, how would you summarize the message of each of these portions? I'm going to stop sharing and get Rabbi up there, and we'll see if anybody wants to jump in.
It is hard to summarize a Torah portion as rich and as deep as the Akedah, but I'm going to do my best. The first thing to say, just to set this conversation, is the binding of Isaac is our traditional Rosh Hashanah reading. This is what we've been reading for the past, since we've had Torah portions. And we'll talk about the many reasons why this is clearly the better Torah portion. Although I should say with integrity and good intent, the Reform movement has given us an alternative and in some ways thematically appropriate alternative reading. If you can't handle the binding of Isaac's story, then certainly the creation story is an option for the weak of heart. I want to say that when we are talking about summarizing this really almost last great moment of Abraham's life, Abraham's 137 years old when this takes place. And this last test takes place at the end of a series of tests in Abraham's life. Our rabbis all agree that Abraham was tested 10 different times. This was the 10th. This was the pinnacle test of Abraham's life. What they cannot agree is what the 10 tests were, which means that every moment of Abraham's life was a test, each one leading up to the next, to the next, to the next, until Abraham now, as a man of 137 years old, is asked to bind his son Isaac. I also want to share, and we can end with this because there's obviously so much more to talk about with our other questions, that others are tested too, right? This is not just a test of Abraham. This is a test of Isaac. This is a test of Sarah. This is actually a test of God as well. And so when we enter into this season of the high holidays, we acknowledge as a people that life is full of tests, of moments when we stand against seemingly impossible challenge. And what the Akedah asks us to consider is who we are and what choice we make in response to the challenges that life presents. And that in its essence is the Akedah.
So we can look and doing, I think that's a great summary. And in fact, I'll share up a little bit later. There's a good piece, actually Debbie Wolf brought it to my attention, a piece that was done in Reform Judaism on the theological underpinnings of the Akedah. Granted, and in fairness and sense, and Aaron is absolutely correct, although I won't go on record saying that. But this portion creates some real problems, I think. And even though we say faint of heart, to take the creation story, I'm wondering for people out there on the message, what is it that we think is the ultimate message of this, and how does it even fit with our Hagim, and especially with Rosh Hashanah? Anybody want to give us any of their thoughts?
If you obey God, you will be as numerous as the stars in heaven. I mean, I think the Akedah story ends with that if because you obeyed God, you met the test, you will be as numerous, your descendants will be numerous. And the same thing in the creation story, it all leads to being a numerous people.
Right, it does, but they're dependent on two different things. And I think that's what we're going to get to in our next question about the theological underpinnings, which makes the creation story actually so fascinating, and some of the history of why it was chosen at certain times by major rabbis to read in their congregations. And we'll get to some of that. But other thoughts about the Akedah. I mean, Aaron brought up some incredible points about the concept of test, right? And Aaron brought up, which is absolutely true about each of us in terms of being tested, which certainly the holidays bring in. And Bill, you bring up exactly obedience to God. Those can be seen as positive, but other thoughts. I got to switch to gallery so I can see people's hands.
In a broader scheme, I mean, there's so many things you can talk about this, and maybe that's the reason why it's there. as an introduction for the year, but it also highlights tremendous inconsistencies. I mean, to Aaron's point, where Abraham was tested 10 times, he certainly didn't just blindly obey God at Sodom and Gomorrah. He pleaded and negotiated with God. So there are times in Abraham's life where it wasn't just this blind obedience of God. And maybe the message is that we've got, that we're tested 10 times or more, but there's inconsistencies. There's just not one right way.
Good. Janice, you had your hand up.
Yes. This was the first time that I ever felt so emotional about the binding itself and the torture that was for Isaac to have to bear watching his father put him in this position, which he couldn't escape.
Janice, can I put you at ease for a moment?
Okay. Actually, for a long time would
Oh,
be
you're so
better.
sweet. Well, the binding of Isaac is a horrific Renaissance painting, right? When you see an old man binding a young, helpless boy. What our rabbinic tradition teaches is that nothing is quite as it seems. And so I'm going to invite people, actually I can show you here, to look at Genesis 17:1. If you look at Genesis 17:1, what you're going to
share it, Aaron?
Yeah, I'll share it.
Super.
I was worried you're going to look at that picture.
So Genesis 17:1 shows, what I want to do is talk about how old Isaac is, because I said that Isaac was tested as well. And this is where our rabbis come to some really interesting math, right? I'm not a math person. Bruce, I don't think is a math person either, but the math here is important.
Hang on there, buddy.
All right. So let me turn to the chat for a minute. When we, oops, my screen. All right. So in Genesis 17:1, here we are. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Avram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. This is the beginning of Isaac's birth. How old is Abraham? 99 years old. And then when we have, let me pull this up one more time. Then when we turn to Genesis 23:1, the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah. And Janice, this is where the math, I hope, alleviates some of the pain and torment that we could otherwise imagine Isaac going through. Here we are. This verse, our rabbinic tradition teaches, takes place the moment Isaac dies. Sarah's lifespan, the span of Sarah's life came to 127 years old. So here's the math. Abraham was 99 years old when he found out that Sarah would conceive, and a year later, at the age of 100, he has a son. That makes Sarah 90 years old when she has Isaac. If Sarah dies at the age of 127 and she has Isaac at the age of 90, do we follow the math?
Yeah.
Then how old is Isaac? 37 years old.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is, Aaron, which is also something that brings up that there are those people in looking at this, and I do this not, but I think this is how rich, and when we talk about that Isaac really is considered in some sense, that there are people that say that Isaac's disabled, that Isaac comes up, and there's a whole school of thought and look at this and talk to this. So Janice, your point, and I'd like you to continue on. I think that there is, talk about what you felt about the cruelty of this, because I think that went into a lot of the understandings of why there was a need for a change. What were you saying? Go ahead.
Well, it just seems so premeditated that Isaac's father had thought this through, bringing along someone to watch the whatever, the lads that were there for a reason. And I guess that's the part that was very difficult. I was struggling with that this time more than ever. And I don't know if that's because of things.
That's an excellent point. We're going to switch. I know Steve Lamb had his hand up as well, but I want to say that if you think about this, there's a large change that takes place if you look and when and who preaches. And I went through this years ago with Dr. Marcus through the archives of who preached on what. During war times, There were those that used the Abraham story in terms to talk about the necessity of sacrifice. There were other people that switched to the Genesis story because the particularistic nature of men and women sacrificing their child for their political or beliefs is something that they felt was morally wrong. And so the contrast between these portions is much more than just the actual, and when we look at Torah, we have eisegesis and exegesis. We have eisegesis in terms of what is inside the text is what Aaron is looking at. The rabbis looked at this and they said, well, he's not a lad. They come through and say, he's of his own mind. He willingly goes. In fact, last night, I used a phrase that supports what Aaron says, Shnehem Yachdav, that the two of them walk. The rabbis make the point that Aaron exactly made, which is the point that they are together because they both believe. Now, there are others that look and say they don't want to do that it's wrong morally for people to sacrifice their own children for their beliefs, that Abraham goes too far, that God goes too far, that the sin of Abraham is exactly the sin of God, that we should do it. And when you think about that theologically, this is where the creation story gives you the alternative, because the creation story, the penultimate of free will, that we are created in the image of God. So let's go on. I know Steve had, I want to get
Rabbi, just one quick thing. Last week we talked about choose life. And here, Isaac's father clearly was not choosing life.
Janice, you're such a good rabbi, because one of the arguments against this is that in Leviticus, it says, Chai b'chem, that you should live by them. So I want to keep the conversation going, because what I want people who are joining us the first time to see the richness of what we do here at Early Torah. Steve, go ahead.
Yes, I think your question was, why the Akedah story for Rosh Hashanah?
Yes.
My answer is, the purpose of Rosh Hashanah is for us to realign ourselves with God. And if we get our act together, on Yom Kippur, he will put us on the good side of the book of life, and we will have all the goodness. The story of the binding of Isaac is the first time we have the interaction between man and God, where man demonstrates that he's following the will of God. And once he's made that demonstration, God says, okay, now you will get all the goodies. So this is the primary presentation of what we, in fact, reenact each year.
So, Steve, you raise a really interesting point, and Aaron can react to this, but I would beg the question of that, is that demonstrating? Is absolute obedience to God and to the law is really demonstrating what God made or God intended for us? Because the creation story, as we take it to its further point, lets us know, which is a pillar of the Reform movement, a pillar of modern thought, is this concept of free will. And, I can't get out of, I'm going to get all praises from Richard Newman for us people who grew up with Midwestern preaching and other things. This is the pillar. This is where Abba Hillel Silver and others stood on and said that we can't, when they rallied against, and even Rabbi Weinberg, when he rallied against the war in Vietnam, the sermons that they were doing in terms of the universal understanding. And so you're absolutely right, Stephen, but it begs some question is this the obedience to God that God is really asking? And so is it yet not a part of a test? And did we pass the test or did we fail the test? Let's go on. There's some other hands, I think.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Simeon Kreisberg.
Oh, no, now we've got an expert on the Akedah. I'm in trouble.
I don't know about that, but let me suggest an alternative interpretation of this very troubling portion, because obviously all of us have been troubled with this one ever since we first heard it. The clue to my interpretation, and I'd be fascinated if there's any commentary on this, is that although it is God that starts the sacrifice of Isaac in motion, it is the angel that stops Now, to me, that suggests that the voice that Abraham hears when he is about to sacrifice his son is not the voice he recognizes as the voice of God. It is a different voice. And that voice, I suggest, is his conscience. And it is when God confirms that this is a man who has a conscience that he feels comfortable that this is somebody with whom I can make my covenant and give my blessings. And therefore, and just to finish up, and the centrality, therefore, of this passage, the reason it's so important to us to reaffirm every year is that what God's most important gift to us is our conscience. This is what gives us the ability to choose right from wrong. And that's what we need to be confirming year by year.
Excellent, Simeon. I would even go further and say that is a way, but I started a little bit before. It says that Abraham sees a ram. Not that there's something that happens simultaneously. Abraham hears the voice of the angel saying, don't do anything. Don't put a mark onto the child. And me'umah, I believe, Aaron, is the Hebrew me'umah. Am I correct? I don't have it in front of me.
I don't have it in front of me either.
Okay. But I believe it is don't make a mark, a blemish on the child. It's the same word that's used.
I think it's don't raise your hand against him.
Yeah. Well, but the part of this is that there's a lot of parallels that are going on in this in the laws of kashrut and the laws of slaughtering and other things. But the most important thing for Simeon that I think happens simultaneously is hears the voice of God, but Abraham on his own sees an alternative. He sees a ram in the thicket. And therefore, it's our own moral conscience is not just left to God, but it's following us. So that's excellent. Richard, go ahead. And then Aaron will come back to you. Thank you. Simeon, that was great. Richard?
All right, thank you. I want to offer a comment, and then Janice does as well. To me, what's going on here, the killing of children is Baal worship. And in a dozen other parsha, we're told you're not allowed to kill your children. And so you can argue that what this is God saying, so you want to be a Baal worshiper or you want to be a God worshiper? And Abraham ultimately makes a decision, no, or God helps Abraham come to the point of, no, I'm not going to sacrifice my child. I'm not going to be a pagan, a Baal worshiper. Janice has a comment.
We must be related.
It's like you're married or something.
In the evolutionary...
little louder, Janice.
Yeah, I was going to say, infanticide was practiced by people back in those days. And I never felt, call me naive, but I never thought that Abraham was actually going to kill Isaac. I thought he was just saying, look, I could do this. Parents threaten their children and then their actions speak louder than the words.
So I think that these are they're wonderful comments in terms of this, but as we look on this, we could actually, and I'm surprised that David Oglon hasn't jumped in here yet, because this could be considered in some sense that, as Aaron mentioned first about the test that's there, that we're on a learning curve of the relationship. Both Simeon and Steve Lamb brought up the fact of a first time of the relationship and the interchange that's going on between humanity and God based on what God tells us and what we're going to do. And that all starts when we get to it with the concept of creation. Aaron, you were going to make a comment.
I was going to say two things. First, I want to respond to Simeon. And Simeon, I never thought about Abraham's own conscience speaking to him. I think that's a fascinating point. I want to add to that, which is there are many times, most of the time, especially when we turn to the season of Teshuvah, when our conscience speaks to us too late. And that's what happens with Abraham and Isaac. It's been well sermonized that Abraham and Isaac never speak to each other again from this moment on. That Abraham's conscience speaks after it is too late. And this is such a a question. This is the question that we ask ourselves every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. What can we do now that it's too late? Right? Now that we've already done the thing or things that we regret, what becomes of those decisions? And the promise of Rosh Hashanah and the promise of human nature is that the things that get us into trouble over and over again, we will almost certainly have the opportunity to be presented with that choice in short order. And so what happens? Abraham does not have this gift of being able to reverse his decision, but looking ahead at the year to come, are we going to be different people in response to the same thing that's gotten us into trouble before, right? Are we going to let our conscience speak before we act yet again? That's in so many ways another message of our high holiday season. And so, Simeon, I want to thank you for that insight. I also realize that we're spending a lot of time talking about and even defending the Abraham story. Not everyone's defending it, obviously, but we're not spending that much time on the creation story, Rabbi. So, let's make this a fair fight.
We will, but I want to just counter you and just saying that I although it's been sermonized, the text says something very different. It says, V'yelchu yachdav. And there's a whole thing and that's what I said last night in my sermon, yachdav, that they returned together. And that is something that this act of the merge of consciousness and the act of this merge of conscience to the moment, consciousness and conscience, which is what I think Simeon was saying, and that's what I added in terms of seeing, that there's this synothesis that goes on between their senses. The moral instinct inside, that means that Steve talks about that, and that there's a moral parameter here, and what Simeon said, that it's the moral act of conscience that he hears. And then my sense is that the creative idea that he sees an alternative. He sees the ram in the thicket. All right, moving to the creation story. To prove that Miller is absolutely wrong. Aaron is, and I will tell you this, and I'm going to share up, there's a great story, a great article that I'll bring up, and it brings up many of the points that Aaron has made beautifully this morning. But I want
to have shown me this before. I would have saved a lot of prep time.
Yeah, I would, but I don't like to get into those things. That's what happens, It's why I can still be a mentor if I know certain things. And I didn't know it till actually Debbie gave it to me, so I have to admit. But it's a great article. What I want to tell you is that I think when we think about the creation story, it is again putting the underpinnings of Rosh Hashanah thematically in the understanding that this is a universal story. The Akedah becomes a particularistic story because we are, if you take this and that, and without all the things, a promise is made to Abraham of a specific people and a specific thing that is through him that we're going to get this greatness and this way of God's relationship. And it's through Abraham. The creation story is an absolutely universalistic story. It is about the birth of the world. It is about what happens. It puts things in order. It lets us know that the underpinnings of the world are theologically underpinned. That the way of the world is theologically underpinning. And so when we go together and we look at this creation story is in many ways a real explanation of an alternative that is not necessarily for the weak of heart, but really getting to the universalistic aspects of the Hagim. And we go from Rosh Hashanah, the creation of the world, the creation of the human being, which we go to, which is the most universalistic holiday that we have based on creation and things, to the most specific holiday, particularistic holiday, which is about my relationship with God and my relationship with other human beings. And therefore, the contrast between what happens, even at the beginning of the Torah portion that's set there, is when we think about it, why do we read Nitzavim? Atem Nitzavim Hayom, Kulchem Hayom, Lifneim, all of you are standing this day, because there's that dichotomy that goes on between being part of a huge community and my individual responsibility. So I think that the alternative that has been given, and certainly I have to tell you that hearing the Akedah story when I was a kid, and when I began to realize what was going on, you know, and when you had a German Jewish mother like mine who had a purse, you know, and I think some of you have read my story that that's in Jane Levy's book, that I got kicked out of services because I had my transistor radio up my ear, which my dad had given me for a birthday or Hanukkah or whatever. And that just when Vince Scully goes, it's a hit, I got hit by my purse, because I didn't realize when I stood up for the first time, my earplug would come unplugged from my radio in my pocket, and the whole sanctuary heard it's a hit. And so I got banished to the library, where, thank God for the men's club, the Men of Reformed Judaism Brotherhood, then called, had a color TV. It's the first time I saw color TV and got to watch the World Series being punished. So but when I heard as a kid and heard that story being told about that Abraham sacrifices his son, I had the same incredible trepidation. The creation story is got some incredible things. It lets us know that not just what's happening for the Jews, but it's happening for everyone. And Rosh Hashanah is about the creation, the birth of the world, and our responsibility in part of that birth. All right, comments on the creation story. Go to the gallery view and see if there are comments.
Bruce,
Yes.
it's when I was reading along, listening to Bill, it's so dramatic, the emergence of the land, and that the first thing that happens is separating light from dark, and all of that is so it's almost as though God doesn't know what's there before he makes these sort of grand decisions or grand, pronouncements. I mean, let there be light, and there was light. And then he, brings the earth,
right,
separates the water so that the earth is an expanse. But I have the sense that he didn't necessarily know what it was all going to look like when it happened. And
so if I'm hearing what you're saying, I just want to clarify that what's powerful is the way that we move from chaos to order, and that there's this process that takes place. And you're saying there's even, seems like underneath it, there's a sense of amazement, even for God, that all these things begin to unfold in a certain way. So you'd almost be, I mean, Oblon's going to pick up on this, in that the learning of God, and for those who go through, but I think the dramatic part of this, Debbie, is a really important part, and that we're part of that creation story. Because if you remember, when some of these are beginning to be read, and when choices of rabbis are making the choice to read the Genesis story, man is really thinking man's self as being in charge of everything. There's, we have Hiroshima, we have world wars, we have all sorts of political things that are going on. There are a lot of rabbis that stood up and chose and wanted to remind us that we're part of creation, and that we are subservient in that way. Gabrielle had a comment, I think. Did I see your hand up, Gabrielle?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I wanted first to say that I would hope before we end that I can hear from Rabbi Miller sacrifice in your parsha, and from Rabbi Lustig, creation in yours and sacrifice in Rabbi Lustig's. I just thought it would be a nice flip. And I think I got the idea from Simeon that perhaps in the Akedah, the creation is perhaps of a conscience. But juxtaposing on not juxtaposing, Deborah's point of the separation and the slowness, I wanted to say, it seemed like we, with the pandemic, are in the identical place in terms of creating day by day what we don't know and sitting back and being in awe of it.
Can I say something, Rabbi Lustig?
Sure, Ruth, quickly.
I think that you started it very good when you said that in those days, people used to sacrifice their children for the purpose of winning. And then Rabbi Miller came and mentioned the word that we did it differently. How did the victor who won the war of Troy, he killed his own daughter, Iphigenia. He cut her throat so he will have the wind for the ships to go faster to Troy. But he killed his own daughter. And in our religion, Abraham, who was the greatest genius, who saw that idolatry is not the thing to believe in, but monotheism, something that we don't see, and not things that can break. So he came with the idea
Understood.
that he doesn't have to kill a human being.
Ruth, very good point. Really excellent, because I think the underpinning that, excuse me, that's my dog in the background. I think that one of the things that is so, Rabbi Miller brought this up in both of these, we ask the questions, how is humanity portrayed in these? And how are Jews portrayed in this? And I think in both of this is that there's a richness to both of these theologically. And Aaron, Rabbi Miller, if you want to comment on this in any way, but the beauty that is brought up is that Abraham doesn't sacrifice his child, okay? That there is a stop and that we do things differently. And the beauty of the creation story is that we are created in the image of God. Even though we're said in that story that we have dominion over certain things, but if we're made like God, it means that we have to have that conscience. We have to have that ability to stop the hand before we do it. Remembering that in creation, of all creatures created on earth, human beings are one of the only ones that doesn't have the capacity like animals to bare their neck. Dogs fight, they will bare their necks. A wolf fight, when you show your jugular vein, you will not be killed. Human beings don't have that instinct, unfortunately. We have to learn that. It's not something that's innate. It has to be learned. Aaron.
Yeah, I'd say that the contrast between these two stories, and there's so many, is that in the creation story, we are created in the image of God, and Rosh Hashanah is about when we fail to live up to that creation. The countless times that we fall short. And one of the things that I find so fascinating and beautiful about the Akedah story is the ram itself. We haven't talked about the ram all that much, but the ram itself, our rabbinic tradition has a incredible depth with just this ram. And one of the things that they point out after Abraham performs this act of courage, of stupidity, of morality or immorality, however it is meant to be interpreted by each of us, the ram comes next. And what our rabbinic tradition teaches is that the horns of the ram are blown at 2 points in Jewish history. The first moment that the horns of this ram were blown were at the foot of Mount Sinai, when we truly became a people. And the second time we see this ram, and this is the important part for this piece, is when the Messiah comes. And so the horns of this ram, representing in so many ways Abraham's, I think we can all safely say, mistake or regretful decision, shows us that even after a mistake, even after a monumental mistake like the one Abraham makes, redemption can come next, right? If we do this season right, if we enter into this season of atonement with an open heart and an honest soul, redemption can come next. And that is also a part of our Rosh Hashanah story.
Hey, Aaron, I'm not so sure if we could bring Aaron into this Abraham into this conversation. He would say it was a mistake. I mean, he's gone down, particularly in more traditional circles, as a great hero.
Sure.
In part because of this story, not because it was a mistake.
You know, and it's fascinating. And there's an alternative lens of looking at the Abraham, the binding of Isaac's story, which is, what did Abraham actually believe this entire time? And is this a test of Abraham, or is it a test of God? You know, one of the things that we see, and you know, you could read this as Abraham actually never lies. Abraham says that we're going to go up the mountain, we're going to come back down together, that God will provide a ram, and all of these things come true. And one of the things that we can see, which I find so fascinating, is that in one of the verses, let's see, this is verse, let's see, it is verse 4. In verse 4, they walk for it for 3 days. 3 days just happens in a flash, right? It is very fast time, nothing to pay attention to. But then we have, I like to call this almost our game of chicken, right? In our game of chicken, in verses 9 and 10, they arrived at the place. Abraham builds an altar. Abraham lays down the wood. He binds his son Isaac, lays him on the altar on top of the wood, picks up the knife, and then his hand is stopped. It's almost as though Abraham is testing God, saying, I know you're not going to make me do this. When are you going to stop me? When are you going to show me the God that I believe in? That's Abraham's test of God. And so look, there are 100 different layers that we could look at with this particular test.
Make it
turn off
the video.
So one of the things that, you know, I love, and Aaron mentioned to this, the Renaissance and the painters, there are so many incredible pieces. I actually have a woodcut that was given to me, Ava Shalom, by my former mother-in-law, that is a beautiful, beautiful woodcut. And it's of the binding of Isaac. And what I love most about it is, in many of the paintings, when the knife is up in the air, Abraham's other hand is shielding the face of Isaac. It's not holding him down in his base, but it's over his face so he won't see. So, and there's this act of compassion that's there. And there's this whole understanding of looking at the art. And so one of the things that I think that, you know, is so fascinating about this in these Torah portions is, what is it that is in both of these portions? Who is the God that we're introduced to? And at this high holiday season, what is the nature of the theological message in each of these stories? And the other question that we had for you as well is that what is the layout of what humanity's role is in each of the stories? And it's a much more compelling, in many ways, we are just part of creation. We're part of all the things. We're part of creation. We're part of things. We're no higher, no lower, although it said we're given dominion for certain things. And then in the creation, in the Akedah story, there's a struggle that goes on between man and humanity, between the generations, between fulfilling belief and whatever. And all of these are incredibly compelling thoughts as we begin on this first day of a new year, in some of the most challenging times that we have, to think about what is our role in our relationship to God and what is our role in relationship both to text. Steve Lamb, I think, had his hand up.
Yes, going back to the creation story. One of the things I find fascinating is—
You meant the appropriate story. Go ahead.
Each time God creates something, he says that it is good, with one exception. When he creates man, he does not say it is good. He skips that, he goes, and then shows that all these things together unify in one great thing. And only when he sees a completed package does he say not only that it's good, but that it's very good.
So you bring up, Steve, an excellent point that I think we have to think about. And I believe that it's a counterbalance to the very first point that you brought up about obedience to God. And obedience to God is not only in the nature of this is not only pleasing God, but pleasing the nature of how you fit in to the realm of creation. And that's very important. And when we think about the world that we live in, we have tremendous responsibilities in that area. If we think about global warming and other things, and not ignoring the things that are wrong in this way. And I think, for me, one of the most, I'm a very visual and very tactile sort of individual. And so in this sort of thing, the question that Aaron asked a minute ago, and somebody said, what would Abraham think? There are clues. Abraham looks and sees a ram. He's looking around. He's not able to look at his son, I think. He knows what's happening in terms of, and is not feeling comfortable. And the real question is, we have little or no insight to Isaac's thinking at all. And Isaac, if you will, becomes, in my mind, is I used to call him Nixon silent majority. He just doesn't say anything. He goes along for the ride on that level. Are you going to bring up some of the Midrash?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, in a way, we could see this as a test of Abraham. We could see this as a test of God. We could also, going back, we could see this as a test of Isaac, right? I mean, this is in so many ways the story of faith for a strong and able-bodied 37-year-old man who is at the cusp of life's incredible possibilities. And part of what our rabbinic tradition teaches is that while Abraham was looking down at his son, Isaac's eyes were looking up. And in this moment of self-sacrifice, in this moment of giving everything that Isaac could, Isaac is given a glimpse into the heavens themselves. And in glimpsing into the heavens, he is actually physically blinded by this moment, even though he attained spiritual insight and wisdom, and actually remains visually impaired for the rest of his life.
Yeah, those are all beautiful supports, but I think that those speak to me to the rabbis' incredible discomfort of what they know is wrong with the situation that Isaac is in.
Oh, sure. And by the way, I'm not saying that this is that Abraham made the right decision. What I'm saying is this Torah portion is about what happens after you make the wrong choice.
No, but I also I think that, you bring up an incredible point, because what Aaron is speaking to, that there's first of all, this is the Rosh Hashanah portion. So there's, there's every commentary, but these commentaries, the Midrash after Midrash, and the idea of, the use of the horns, we're another place, ein mukdam, ein acher, that there's no early or late in Torah, that this is all fitting into the order and things of God's plan, and everything is laid out. I think that for what Simeon has said and what we're talking about, and for my comfort with creation is that I am much more, I'll let God worry about God. I think Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is about us worrying about us. And believe me, in the world that we're living in, we got plenty to worry about. And the reality is that what is being asked of us in both of these stories is what role will humanity play? And it's not so much the theological underpinnings here but what is the role of humanity? What does it mean if we're created into the image of God? And what does it mean if we have free will? And what does it mean we have the possibility that if we're being tested like Abraham, or we're being tested by Isaac, whether we're going to go on and have faith in what has been? Go ahead. Let's see. I want to look and see. Are there other folks? I know that we've got some. I want to make sure that other people get a chance. Gerald, go ahead. Jerry?
Rabbi, it's incredible. I find from this the melding of conscience and free will. Absolutely incredible concept. But both of you guys, rabbis, is really, to me, the foundation of life, or the foundation of my relationship with God, and not looking at a wonderful book, the Torah, not reading it word for word or how someone is telling me to read it, but rather my reading it and it moving forward in life, the way the Reform movement has moved forward in life. And you've made this so clear to me, that these pieces are a foundation for me and for my going forward in life in terms of my thoughts, my conscience, my free will. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead. There's Adam, you had a comment?
Yeah, and Kate does also, and they're probably entirely different. but it touches on something that I think a few people touched on, but something I'm not trying to say Rabbi Miller should get a point or something on the scoreboard.
You can say that if you want.
I go Rabbi Lustig's side.
But I think there is an important thing here, at least to me, in the fact that when you even say creation story versus binding of Isaac, there's only one binding of Isaac here. There's only one Akedah. Whereas creation story, Kate even turned to me and said, wait, is this Adam and Eve though? And it's like, no, they had to go back and add that other piece in. And if you believe exactly as was said before, everything is written the way that it's supposed to be written. There's no extra, there's no before, there's no after. With all of that, if it was intended that the creation story was supposed to have everything all together, it would still be part of Bereshit. There wouldn't be, exactly as Steve said, about putting in, the very good. That story would have been inserted. The Garden of Eden story would have been inserted there. It wouldn't have been, hey, we need to add this on extra. So to me, there's something important that there isn't an extra corollary of, hey, let me explain to you in the Torah officially, not in the extra commentaries, but let me tell you what actually was going on with how that ram appeared and some of this other stuff. We didn't actually have to have this extra story, this extra justification of, let me point out all these other things with Baal, and you have to understand all these other things. The story was sort of so good on its own, it could stand up and hold up and not need extra things put into it.
I disagree.
Wait, Kate, before I just want to clarify something. The concept that Aaron and I talk about, Ein Mukdan and Ein Acher, is a concept that the rabbis can use, that there's no early or late. That's why they can have Moses sitting in Moses sitting in a class of Hillel, or Abraham sitting. So it's not that everything is laid out in the Torah and that we should accept it in terms of that. There are different ways, as you brought up, Adam, very clearly, that see an edited version of the Torah or a Torah that's laid out and it's just all continuous. Kate, I don't want to miss you, because if you're going to make points for me, we got to get them in there.
I think the Akedah is better for Yom Kippur, because right now in Rosh Hashanah, I'd rather have the God in the Renaissance painting that's creating Adam. Adam, in the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel, he's exhausted. Adam is for breath, and God comes to Adam. He touches his hand, and Adam wakes up. I want that God at the moment. I don't really want the insecure binding of Isaac God, because I think Abraham's kind of going a little crazy,
Well, I also think I as a painter myself and an aesthete like you, I certainly appreciate your opinion. We're going to get quickly Joanne, and then because I want to make sure that other people that we haven't got a chance. Go ahead, Joanne.
I think that the two of them together are perfect. One of them showing the absolute might of God in creating the world, and then putting Abraham to the test. Like we are all tested every year. We are tested as to whether we're going to be true to ourselves. We're tested. And then God saying to us that we can be forgiven. We are given salvation. We are allowed to go on with our lives. They're just
very beautiful. And on that note, since we're 2 minutes away and I want to give people time to join in, because you don't want to miss this morning. It's a beautiful service. I want to make two things. First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Miller for his graciousness in being so dutifully defeated. What Aaron and I wanted to do, and the reason we came up with this idea, and when we were going over schedules, I wanted other people to see the joy that, make sure you're muted, folks. I wanted to see the joy that we have in every day, every Saturday morning at 9 to 10 o'clock, of having a robust and beautiful conversation and learning together, and that Torah really is the combination of the text and what we bring to bear to the text in our interpretations. And so I hope people had a chance. I want to thank Rabbi Miller for doing this with me and for doing that.
And this is fun.
Our great debates. I also just want to tell you that today you should definitely hear Rabbi Fishel's sermon. It is very, very powerful. And I hope you will tune in at 10:30 for our premiere of our services. I also want to invite you all to come back and join us, and you have to register for our discussion on racial equality. That's going to be a panel at 2 o'clock this afternoon. We have Cornell Brooks, who is joining us, former president of the NAACP at the Harvard School, at the Kennedy School at Harvard and Yale Divinity School. We have Yolanda Price, the first woman dean of Howard University's Divinity School. We have Professor Jacques Berliner-Blau and his co-teacher Terrence Johnson, both of Georgetown University, who've been teaching classes and just wrote a new book that'll come out soon on Black-Jewish relations. And we have Reverend Mark Thomas, a young pastor who grew up at the knee of Anthony Lewis and continuing in the great work, civil rights work of Anthony Lewis. And we have Rabbi Shankman and I who will be monitoring and participating. We hope you will join us. Most of all, and I know Rabbi Miller joins me, we wish to each of you a Shana Tova. May the sweetness of Torah and the intellectual things that we gain from each other continue to prove to you that Torah can only be the way Rabbi Lustig says it is. Now,
That's when he's wrong.
No. First of all, thank you. Shana Tova to all of you. Aaron, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. If you've just joined us every Saturday morning at 9 to 10, and we wish you all Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.